13 this evening, finishing the chapter, but not the conversation. The conversation that Job is having here with God is going to go on into chapter 14, but there's a couple of different sections, and so down through verse 28 will finish up the first area we're looking at here. Job chapter 13, starting with verse 19. Who is he that will plead with me? For now if I hold my tongue, I shall give up the ghost. Only do not two things unto me, then will I not hide myself from thee. Withdraw thine hand far from me, and let not thy dread make me afraid. Then call thou, and I will answer, or let me speak, and answer thou me. How many are mine iniquities and sins? Make me to know my transgression and my sin. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and holdest me for thine enemy? Wilt thou break a leaf driven to and fro? And wilt thou pursue the dry stubble? For thou writest bitterest things against me, and makest me to possess the iniquities of my youth. Thou puttest my feet also in the stocks, and lookest narrowly unto all my paths. Thou settest a print upon the heels of my feet. And he, as a rotten thing, consumeth, as a garment that is moth-eaten. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, tonight as we continue our study here in Job, we see a distressed individual who is most worried about his relationship with you. And in times of difficulty, sometimes that's the last thing that approaches our mind. But if our lives are fixed on you, if you are at the center of everything we do, then in times of silence and in times of difficulty when we don't know why, it seems most difficult to bear. And tonight as we see Job cry out to you, realize that here is a person whose relationship meant so much. Among all the busy things that he had going on in life, his relationship with you was of utmost importance. What an incredible testimony and encouragement to us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Job's friends have been on him, and now he is kind of strongly giving it back a little, if you will, or rebuking some of the things that they have said to him. And we saw his disappointment in his friends in the first 12 verses. And then his declaration of faith in verses 13 through 16. And then he starts this desire to talk with God in this chapter, verses 17 through 28. And it actually goes into chapter 14, I think it's through verse 22. But he started off in verse 17 and 18, very interesting thing that we looked at last week. His friends are invited to listen, but they're told to be quiet. And no interrupting, don't need your opinion because I want a conversation with God, but you are more than willing to listen. And then in verse 19, he has this passionate plan. And so he's asking God here, and he's really hoping that that he is going to show up and give him an answer to why he's suffering for all this. When you go through difficulty, it helps a little bit to know why. And Job is struggling with God's silence, and he's struggling with not knowing why all this is happening to him. In verse 19, who is he that will plead with me? For now if I hold my tongue, I shall give up the ghost. Let my accuser come forward with the charges, is what he's saying. And he's not, again, the conversation shifted, so he's not encouraging the friends, because the friends, all three of them so far, I believe it's Elihu, is the only one who has been silent. He's going to speak up in chapter 33 after everybody has a couple of goes at Job. But he's asking God, I want to know the charges, and I want to be able to defend myself. And so that's what he's really praying for here. Who is he that will plead with me? Who is going to tell me what the charges are? Because I would really like to be able to answer them. And then the second half is important because he says, for now, if I hold my tongue, I shall give up the ghost. Defending myself is as important as breathing to me, is what he is saying. These guys keep attacking him instead of coming alongside of him and being an encouragement. He doesn't have anyone that he can talk to. He doesn't have anyone that he can see that has not accused him of having secret sin and being responsible for everything that has happened. Eliphaz was nasty, right? He just blatantly said, your kids are dead because of you. And you'd think, the next one maybe would, and they kind of soften at first, and then it's like they got to get their punches in too. And so everywhere he has turned, and he has been accused of harboring secret sin, and he's the reason that all this stuff has happened to him. And so we see this really passionate plea in verse 19. I wish God would lay the charges out here and let me defend myself. Because at this point, it's just as important to me as breathing. You could say it, if anyone can prove me false, I would just keep silent and die. So he so strongly believes that his conscience is clear before God, that as these three friends come at him and attack him of having secret sin, he said, listen, if anyone could prove my conscience false, then I might as well just quit breathing and dying, because then I'm not right with God, and I don't have the relationship that I thought I did, and I don't have the testimony that I thought I did. We would say it this way. If we were going to use an English proverb to explain what Job is saying here in verse 19, we would say, I would stake my life on it. That's what he's saying here. If God would show up and lay out the charges and give me an opportunity, I would stake my life on that chance. Because in front of his four friends, but three of speaking friends, he wants to be able to have a conversation with God and understand why this is going on, and have them know that this isn't because of a secret sin. There are some ground rules that he wants to lay for this discussion, and we see these in verses 20 through 22. Only do not two things unto me, then will I not hide myself from thee. What's interesting about this little section is God's name is never mentioned in this prayer, if you will, in this pleading with God, in this wanting to talk to him. But the second person pronouns have all changed to the singular tense. At the beginning of the chapter, when he is talking to the friends and he is rebuking them, and even in 17 and 18 where he is inviting them to listen, he is using plural pronouns. So we know that he is talking to the four gentlemen that are sitting there and the three that are arguing with him. But now they are all singular tense. So he's not talking to the friends. He's starting a new conversation. And as he starts this new conversation, there are some things that he wants God to understand. These two things are really important to me, and if these two conditions can be met, then I do not feel like I have to hide myself and flee from you. You say, boy, that sounds like really bold language to come before God. Well, look at what he says, though, because verse 20 is he's laying the groundwork here for a proper discussion with a holy and reverent God. That's what he's doing. He is teaching the three friends that have been arguing with him and the one that's silent something about God in this verse. There is a necessary request in order for me to make a meaningful defense. This was mentioned before back in chapter 9 in verse 34. And it was the ground rules for his plea back then. If I could get God in court, these two things would be necessary. Now he's saying, if I could have a conversation with God and he could tell me what I have done, and I would have the opportunity to defend myself, these two ground rules would have to be met. What's interesting is I want you to turn to chapter 33 and verse 7, because Elihu, and when we get there, we'll talk about him a little bit more. Elihu is silent this whole time. He doesn't say anything. He is the youngest, and so we'll take the time when we get to chapter 33, but he says, because I'm young, I let older people who are supposed to be wiser go, and 3 times they're going to speak. So each one gets to say something to Job. Job responds to them. They go second one, third one, then they start back over with first one, second one, third one, first one, second one, and after all of the older friends have spoken 3 times to Job, and it doesn't seem like the conversation's going anywhere, Elihu's finally going to say something. In chapter 33 and verse 7 it says, "Behold, my terror shall not make thee afraid, neither shall my hand be heavy upon thee." He wants to speak in God's stead, and he's been listening to Job talk to his friends because Job keeps bringing up these 2 conditions. If I'm going to talk to God, then these 2 conditions have to happen. So Elihu gets it. Because when it's his turn to talk, he comes at Job and he says, if I were talking in God's stead, I would meet your 2 conditions, Job. All the way back in chapter 33. So jump back to chapter 13 and let's see what these conditions are in verse 21. He says, "Withdraw thine hand far from me." In other words, it's hard to think and it's hard to speak under the torment of these trials and judgments. If I'm going to have a proper conversation with you, and if I'm going to be able to organize my thoughts and to speak clearly and represent myself well, I'm going to need you to suspend my torment while we talk. That's the first request. The second one is, let not thy dread make me afraid. Now, we don't talk like this anymore, but we ought to have this opinion of God. He says, do not come at me in all of your fierce, majestic glory. If we're going to have a conversation, there is no way that we can have a conversation if you come at me in your full Shekinah glory, because I can't take it. I'm not going to be able to stand there and have a conversation in such a way. You're going to have to come in a kind and in a humble fashion as in a conversation. Now, it's interesting to me that when God first meets Moses, Moses ends up face down on the ground because he is aware of the glory of God. But it takes him a little bit, right? He turns aside to see the burning bush, and he starts to have this conversation, and he is not in fear and dread of a voice coming out of a burning bush that isn't being consumed. He's just kind of in shock and awe that there's a burning bush that isn't being consumed, and he hears a voice. That's the way Job says, I'm going to have a conversation with you. Then you go up on Mount Horeb, if we fast forward, and here comes the law. And when God's getting ready to give the law, the mountain's on fire and everything's quaking and there's lightning and all kinds of stuff going on and earthquakes, and Israel is so scared to death to come close to the mountain, and Moses moseys on up there, and eventually he has a very strange request. He's been 30 days up there talking with God. I mean, that just has to be incredible. That's one of those things you think, that's about the closest you can get to heaven, probably, is Moses standing on Mount Horeb talking to God about the law and listening. And he enjoys it so much, he asks to be able to see God. Does God come to him like he does in the burning bush? No. He shoves him in a crack of the rock, and he lets just a little bit of the shadow of his Shekinah glory pass by, and Moses' face shines for 30 days. Job's saying, come on, there is no way I can have a conversation with you in that situation. Who could? And so he is not being offensive. He's not being a braggart. He's not challenging God. Actually, verse 21 is the exact opposite. He's actually holding God up in front of the friends that are sitting there and saying, I would love to have a conversation with him, but I can't have a conversation with him like I can have a conversation with y'all. He would have to relent the torment a little bit so that I can function as a normal human being. And he would have to come to me in kind and humble fashion, not with all of the majesty of his greatness. Because I couldn't bear to have a conversation that way. We see the respect continue in verse 22. Then call thou and I will answer, or let me speak and answer thou me. God, you choose the method. Either you start the conversation and call me and give me the charges and then I'll defend myself, or let me argue with the severity of the trial that I'm going through and you show me the reason for it. I'll leave it up to you. If you're willing to come and have a conversation and you're willing to ease the situation and not come at me in all your majesty and glory, then you pick. Do you want to show me why I'm wrong and have me attempt to answer? Or are you just going to wait for me to say my piece and then you're going to give the rebuttal? Whichever way is fine. But it is respect. It is lifting him up and appreciating him. Now, these good old boys have been after him and after him and after him that he is harboring some secret sin. And some of the things that they have said to him, boy, you got this naughtiness in your heart, and you're just so stubborn, and you're so proud, you won't let it go, and you won't deal with it. And God has had to do these awful, awful things to you because the sin was an awful, awful sin. And Job keeps saying, boys, my conscience is clear. I don't know of anything. He's going to start in verse 23, and he's telling them that sin deserves to be punished. It's not that I don't think that God is right in punishing sin. That's not Job's argument. His argument is, I don't understand why God's being so severe with me. He doesn't have the right to be severe with me. He's telling them, again, really good doctrine, really good theology here. Sin deserves to be punished. And what's really interesting is this passage reminds us of the lesson that mercy, grace, and propitiation are so important. When God wanted to provide salvation for us, he did not excuse it. That is not justice. That is not righteousness. That is not holiness. Excusing it and saying, you know what, I love you so much, I'm just going to forget that you sinned. That is not what salvation is. Salvation is taking all of the wrath that needs to be poured out on sin and pouring it out on his son instead of pouring it out on me. That's what salvation is. That's why the term propitiation is such an important term. There was a substitute. And Job is saying, I understand that God has the right to punish sin. Look at verse 23. He is very aware of being a sinner. He's not claiming that he's not a sinner. He's just claiming that his conscience is clear of any unconfessed sin that he knows of. In verse 23, it's a good one. He uses 4 words for sin. One of the words he uses twice. And I want to look at him because what he's doing here is he is all-encompassing. How many are mine iniquities? That's our first word. And sins is the second word. Make me to know my transgression is the third word. And then he repeats the second word and says, and my sin. Iniquities. Hebrew word avon. That's funny. Ding dong, Avon's calling. Iniquity's at the door. Boy, that's a lesson in itself. But what is iniquity? Well, this Hebrew word means perversity or any moral evil. And so in other words, what he's describing here is, I would like to know how many are my perversities? How many are my moral failings? Have I lied? Have I cheated? Have I stolen? Have I... Okay? And then he says, and my sins. Chataha. You know, I can't pronounce Hebrew. It means an offense. and it can mean a habitual sin. So sin is a general word for any offense against God, and it can be one that has become a habit, whether you understand it to be a sin or not. And so think about this. You got 4 friends who are listening, and 3 of them have taken some pretty hard shots at Job. And so he's going through and he's saying, I want God to come and tell me, is there any moral evil in my life? Is there any single offense, even if it has been a habitual sin in my life? Then he goes to the 3rd word, transgression, pesha. This is an interesting word because it means to revolt or rebel against authority. And so transgression is where I have transgressed his law. I know what God says about the matter, but when I transgress it, I actually am revolting against what he says, and my heart is in rebellion against his right to tell me what to do. And so, different category. And then he repeats at the end of the verse here, make me to know my transgression and my sin. So you have moral evil, you have revolting or rebelling against God's law, and you have any offense or habitual sin, and that's mentioned twice. There's no doubt. I mean, he's covering the whole gamut here is what he's doing. I want to know if there is a sin in any way, shape, or form that I am guilty of, that I am not aware of. I wish God would show up and tell me about it, because I can't take care of it if I don't know about it. That's what he's saying here. He wants God to be specific. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and holdest me for thine enemy. Friends accuse him of being a sinner in general terms and in hiding the sin. But he has asked in verse 23, how many, and make me to know. So he wants to know, has it been habitual or multiple? And what exactly is it? Is it a sin of offense? Is it a sin of rebellion? Is it a moral failing? You see what he's asking here? He's not throwing a hasty generalization at it like the 3 friends have thrown at him. Oh, now, Job, we know the naughtiness of your little heart. And it has to be really bad because the judgment's really bad. So if you would just humble yourself and confess this thing, God could get back to blessing you and restoring you. And when Job answered his 3 friends each time, they just ignore him. They are bound and determined that he has sin in his heart, and that's the only way that this could be happening to him. Job now is bypassing them and talking to God and saying, I want to know how much. Is it habitual? Is it multiple offenses? And what kind of offense is it? Where in my life exactly and what exactly did I do? Does that sound like somebody who's wanting to hide something? I mean, he's laying it out there and reminds me very much of Psalm 139:23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. That's kind of what he's saying here. Turn with me, if you will, to Psalm 69 and verse 5. It's something that we fail to recognize, but the psalmist nails right on the head here. O God, thou knowest my foolishness, and my sins are not hid from thee. And so many times you think you can hide your sins from God, and if you get away with it with people, then you get away with it with him. And Job doesn't have that attitude. Well, if I just keep saying the same things over and over again, then I can get away with it with my 3 friends. Job is not concerned at all about if his friends are sure that he is guilty of sin. But he is very much concerned that maybe God thinks that he is guilty of sin. Now, God's opinion is what matters to him. Now turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 6. 2 Chronicles chapter 6 and verse 30. Here we have nation of Israel wanting to cry out. But when you go astray, do you really have a right to cry out to God? Look at verse 30. It says, "Then hear thou from heaven thy dwelling place, and forgive and render unto every man according to all his ways, whose heart thou knowest, for thou only knowest the hearts of the children of men." If you're going to repent and turn back to God, you can expect that God is going to know if you're serious or not. And how many times did the nation of Israel kind of cry out to God because they wanted whatever the consequences were to go away, but they weren't really repentant for their sin, and they weren't really wanting to worship him? And so he's saying, listen, you might be able to fool people, but God knows the heart. And so Job is pouring it out there and saying, search my heart, but I wish you'd tell me, because it's killing me that I don't know. Now go back to our passage in Job 13. What horrible thing did I do is basically what he's going to ask here in verses 24 and 25. If my friends are right, what horrible thing did I do? Wherefore hidest thou thy face and holdest me for thine enemy? Hiding your face is a phrase that is used throughout the Old Testament. It's used describing the actions of God, and God uses it to describe his actions toward the nation of Israel. There's kind of two parts to it. Withholding help and favor and forsaking them to their consequences. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 31 and you'll see a good example of this. Sometimes all he has to do is turn us over to the desires of our heart, and then the consequences of sin ends up being a huge punishment. In Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 17, he says, "Then my anger shall be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them. And they shall be devoured, and many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in that day, are not these evils come upon us, because our God is not among us?" And so what he's doing is, when he, I believe it's Psalms, might be Proverbs, it says, "Make thy face to shine upon us." In other words, he's saying, look favorably upon us. Bless our efforts. We want to know that you are involved in what's happening. This is the opposite that we see here, hiding his face. And Job says, why aren't we having a discussion? Why don't you show up in the relationship and tell me what's going on? Why won't you tell me if I have sinned? You are hiding your face. You are withholding your help and your favor. The other half of this is not feeling his presence. Now go to Psalm chapter 13 and verse 1. When you study the cross, sometimes it's easy, because we're human, to get caught up in all the physical pain of all of the things that surround the Easter week. But far more difficult for us is to think of, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Because over and over and over again, Jesus told the disciples, I and my Father are one. We have the same purpose. We have the same power. We have the same. You need to understand, fellas, that I and my Father are one. You want to see the Father? Look at me. Because of the closeness of their relationship. So when he's on the cross in torment, he doesn't cry out, why do my hands and feet hurt so bad? Why has the whipping hurt so bad? Why are the crown of thorns unbearable? Now he did cry out, I thirst. But he didn't say, I'm so thirsty I can't stand it. He does cry out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? A pain that we have a hard time understanding. And we see Job pouring out a little bit of that here, because he desires the relationship with God, and yet it feels like God is hiding himself from him. In Psalm 13, verse 1, "How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me?" That's exactly what Job feels like. We don't know if it's weeks or months or if it's been a year since the awful day when everything started. But what we do know is it sure seems like a long time since he's heard from God and felt close to him. Jump to Psalm 102 and verse 2. Same thing. It's the personal presence. It's the relationship that's suffering here. "Hide not thy face from me in the day when I am in trouble. Incline thine ear unto me in the day when I call. Answer me speedily." Do you think that on that awful day, when the cows show up missing, that Job didn't turn to God to say something? But he doesn't have time, because here comes the next one, and the donkeys are gone, and the camels are gone, and and by the time the last messenger walks in and says, "All your older kids are in the house, and they were having a dinner together, and this wind comes and smites the four corners, and the house fell in, and they're all dead." Job, probably the first time a messenger came running in, wanted to have a conversation with God, but here comes another one busting in the door, and then another one busting in the door, and by the time he gets done, he very much wants to have a conversation with God. And it isn't too long before now he himself is physically suffering. You can't tell me that a holy, righteous, just man that God has held up before Satan and said, "Look, here's a godly individual." You can't tell me that in the midst of all these physical trials, Job hasn't been crying out and seeking God's face. So here we are. He's answering his friends with this conversation with God. And he says, "Why are you hiding your face from me? I'm calling out to you in the midst of this difficulty, and it doesn't seem like you're answering. It doesn't seem like you're present." All of a sudden, it's radio silence. I feel like I'm getting the cold shoulder. He goes a step farther here to tell you the depth of what he feels like, and he says, "And holdest me," at the end of verse 24, "for thine enemy." Boy, it's one thing to have a vibrant relationship with your God, and then all of a sudden to have radio silence. But to get to the point where you feel like you're being treated like an enemy is like the diametric opposite, right? I mean, he is worshiping and he is communing and he's offering his sacrifices and very much aware of any sin in his life. And now he feels like God is treating him as an enemy. That is far from just being neutral in the situation when difficulty is happening, but it seems like, "God, you are actively against me, and I just really want to know why. What made you change how you treat me and see me?" You want to look up a good verse, go to Lamentations chapter 2 and verse 5. God says, "I want to bless you, but I can't bless you, so I'm going to have to do awful things to try and get your attention instead." And that's where Job is. Only thing is, with the nation of Israel, they knew why it was happening, right? They had forsaken him. And Job's really puzzled because he hasn't forsaken God. So while it makes sense in the nation of Israel, Job is confused and it doesn't make sense to him. Then he asks the question in verse 25, "Why crush a frail creature like me?" And he uses two examples here. The first is a windblown leaf, and the second one is stubble or chaff. "Wilt thou break a leaf driven to and fro?" Now, a leaf that's blowing in the wind is not attached. And so it's not nourished and it's not purposeful. Here in the springtime, when everything starts to bud and the leaves come out, we know they have a purpose. It's how they feed the tree. They're accomplishing something. But in the fall, when they turn brown and they fall off the tree, they no longer have a purpose. And they get crunchy. When they're green, they're soft, and then they're even colorful. But they get crunchy and they're just blown around aimlessly. Come down here in the fall with the leaf blower and try and get a bunch of this stuff off the parking lot. And I'm telling you, sometimes it's a chore. You start down here and you blow everything around here, and you get down here and here comes the wind, and you look back and the whole road and half the parking lot's covered. And you're like, it's crazy. This is an exercise in futility. Job's feeling like that. He's getting buffeted this way, and he gets blown over here, and he gets buffeted over here, and he gets blown over here, and then his health is gone, and he's blown over here, and he feels all fragile and dried up like a blown leaf, and he's saying, I don't understand. I thought I had purpose and meaning in my life. But then he goes on and says, stubble or chaff. It's dried up. It has no life left in it. There's no resistance to fire or wind. It's not really useful to anything. It's the leftovers after you cut the grain off. And he says, is that what I am? Is that what the rest of my life is? Am I supposed to live in this miserable condition like it's leftover? I'd be struggling a little bit too, wouldn't you? He very much wants to know what's going on. Look at the two words that he used. Break a leaf, and will you pursue the dry stubble? In other words, God, you are using your effort to torment and to chase this token of a life I have left. Why would you? A dried drowned up leaf is good for what? And it seems like you're putting all this effort into pursuing this dried up leaf or this stubble that's worthless. Verse 26, God knows the record books. For thou writest bitter things against me, and makest me to possess the iniquities of my youth. Writest is when the Supreme Court hands down a decision, like they did a week ago. You have a group that writes for, and you have a group that writes against. This is what we did, and this is why we did it. In court, the judge stands up there and gives the sentence to the criminal. Boom. You are condemned too. And there's a clerk or a stenographer sitting over there typing 1,000 words a minute. That's what this is. You have written out my sentence. We see that in Psalm 149:9, Jeremiah 22:30. The Jeremiah passage is interesting because God says, let them be written childless. In other words, I don't care what you do. It doesn't matter what you try to do or what you think you're going to do. I have written it out as a sentence because of your sin that you will be childless. And guess what? They were childless. That's the thought here that Job is getting to. And he says, bitter things. It's a terrible sentence. And the friends would say, because it has to be a terrible crime, right? And then he's going to go on and he's going to say, makest me to possess the iniquities of my youth. Am I paying for something I did as a young person? My conscience is clear right now, and I can't think of any sin that I've done. But did I do something when I was a young person and you wrote out my sentence, and now mercy and grace are done, and I'm being punished for it? Is the thought here. Even though my conscience is clear, maybe I did something in my past. And I can't think of anything recent. So it must have been before when I was a younger person and I didn't confess it, and now I'm being held accountable for it. And then he closes this section in verses 27 and 28 and says, God judges sin. Listen, he's not arguing with his friends. Not that sin doesn't deserve to be judged. And now he's saying God doesn't just excuse it. Thou puttest my feet also in the stocks, and lookest narrowly unto all my paths. Thou settest a print upon the heels of my feet. I am encompassed by judgment, like having my feet in stocks. You get your feet put in stocks, you can't move anywhere. You don't have any freedom. You don't have any liberty of movement. And Job feels like he's been attacked from every side, and it has boxed him in, and he might as well be in the stocks because he can't do anything to get away from it. And he says, you look narrowly on me. It means to be strict and diligent in searching the actions of my life. You imagine Paul and Silas being in stocks in the prison, and they can't go anywhere, and having the crowd just be allowed to come in there and start grilling them and asking them questions and persecuting them. That's what Job is feeling right here. He feels like he's under the microscope, the highest level of scrutiny and accountability, each and every one of them being punished. Thou settest a print. This is an interesting phrase. A lot of people think, well, it means God has put so much pressure on him that his sandals have made an imprint on his feet. I don't think that's what he's saying here. I believe what he's saying here, he feels like he's following so closely at his heels, you're practically giving me a flat tire stepping on my shoes. Have you ever had anybody just follow right behind you, and there's that weird feeling because they're invading your personal space and they're breathing down the back of your neck? That's what he feels like. He feels like God is observing all of his actions, and he's breathing down the back of his neck, and he's right there on the back of his heels. And at the same time, he's pursuing him with judgment, and it doesn't feel like Job can do anything to get away with it, because there's always this feeling of looming trouble hanging right over top of him in the worst of conditions. And then in verse 28 he says, and he as a rotten thing consumeth, as a garment that is moth-eaten. He's feeling the effect of the judgment and the trial that he's dealing with. He feels like his body is a rotten thing. I guess so. I mean, he probably looks awful. He probably smells awful. And he feels awful. He says, I've been eaten away like a moth, destroying a garment. I have no strength. I have no beauty. I have no function anymore. I'm sitting out here on this ash heap, and I feel useless and wasted. You say, what's the big deal of this section? The friends have been accusing him of sin. They say it's the reason for his torment. Job has been saying that his conscience is clean, but he wants his friends to know that he is aware that a holy God hates sin, and a holy God punishes sin. But what he really wants to know is he wants God to tell him why. Will you not just explain the reason for the suffering? He's not questioning God's character. He is not being up and coming and improper in the way that he approaches God. It's actually the opposite. He's begging for mercy, but he wants to hear from God, and he wants to hear from him in the worst way. We'll continue on next week with chapter